Broadcasting live from the Black Hills of South Dakota, this is your news leader, the Rapid City Journal.
All right. Is everyone else ready?
My nose itches, hold on.
Yes.
I'm ready.
Okay, perfect. And you can kind of, I guess, look in between or something.
Scan the room.
Yeah, that works. Can we start with both of your first, last names, spelling of both in positions, please?
Vicki Fisher, Vicki Fisher, Interim Community Development Director.
Joel Landeen, Joel Landeen, City Attorney.
Okay, perfect.
The City Attorney.
All right, so ahead of this working group, can you just tell us, what are some of the big things that you guys are going to be talking about specifically in regards to legalization of marijuana in the city and how that's going to be rolled out?
As far as tomorrow's working session, the ordinance that we're bringing forward essentially just maintains the status quo for now as far as businesses that would sell, manufacture, or produce marijuana. We really don't regulate the consumption, so I think July 1st that becomes legal. That's not something we really control. But one of the questions is if dispensaries or manufacturing facilities, just like any other business, where can those go? What, if any, requirements or regulations are going to be imposed on those businesses beyond the state? One of the issues that we have right now is that even though the initiated measure said that medical marijuana becomes legal on July 1st, they gave the state until October 29th to develop rules. So we have a situation where technically it becomes legal July 1st, but the state hasn't adopted any rules yet. And they're doing a summer session. And so hopefully by the end of the summer, we'll have some rules and guidelines. So we've all the municipalities have been kind of waiting to see what the state does. And at this point, a lot of the communities are either moving forward, not knowing what the state rules are, or doing something similar to what we're doing, which is saying we are going to zone this or regulate where these are located, but we can't really adopt our regulations until we know what the state's doing. So I would hope, we're obviously watching what the state's doing, and what we're hoping is that we'll get some guidance here within the next few months, and then kind of parallel with that, we've started working on some zoning ordinances, and that's Vicki and her staff have been working on. So we'll bring those forward, but a lot of the questions are really going to be policy questions and decisions for the council. And so when those actual rules come out, we will have public hearings. There's a whole process in the Planning Commission for public hearings and requiring public input, so the public will have their input into the process and what the rules are, and then ultimately the city council will decide what the rules and regulations are going to be and where the businesses can be located and if there's any other restrictions on them.
So just to put this into perspective for you, many of you are familiar with breweries that we have here in town. We have some wineries, and we even have one distillery that's downtown. For the city, we identify what zoning districts the use should be allowed as a conditional use. And within those conditions, we stipulate that it has to meet state licensing requirements. And so when Joel is saying that we're waiting to see what comes out of the state, that's that parameter that we're really looking for. So this is not something unique. We see it often when we have a use such as this. And I just refer back to those that we all are familiar with, breweries, wineries, and distilleries. And we're following suit with that.
So it was mentioned at the Planning Commission that the city, and I think in the ordinance, that the city will be studying medical cannabis and how it would correspond with the city's comprehensive plan. I guess, Vicki, could you talk about what that study will kind of entail, and if it is that zoning that you're looking at?
That is really the zoning. That is a really good question. And just a little background. From the moment that this was originally approved by the voters of our state, the planners across the state didn't waste any time. We started doing Zoom meetings and talking about what it should look like in our communities. We wanted to ensure that we weren't missing anything. We were challenging each other, sometimes reaching out to state representatives to ensure that we were looking at the document that was passed correctly, and visiting as a whole to see how we wanted South Dakota to look at this use. There are 4 areas of the use: dispensary, testing, cultivating, and manufacturing. And what districts should those individual uses be allowed? Where should they be permitted? Where should they be a conditional use? What's the separation? We know that the law says that you have to be 1,000 foot from any school, but then it kind of leaves it open. When we look at how we would address other similar uses, on-sale liquor as an example, a packaged liquor store, we try to keep those 500 feet from a school or a church, a park, or a residential district. And so looking at, do we compare that to this use and how that might be implemented. But it is important to note that what we've done so far is an outline. And it's going to take the input of our elected officials and our community as a whole for Rapid City to fall just where they need to be on what our final draft looks like. We will come forward with options and an outline, and then we'll listen and we'll make revisions as needed.
So state lawmakers, they're also going to be taking some tours of some other states' facilities. Will there be any involvement with the city doing anything similar to that, or will you be waiting to see what their results are, and again, combining that with your research and what you all are doing here?
So I have reached out, had contact with one agency out of Minnesota, and I know that that is one of the facilities that they will be touring. I don't know that we'll get the opportunity to tour it, but they are willing to come here and give us some hands-on training. So I look forward to what they bring to the table as well. And in particular, odor is something that many communities are concerned with. Some of the states that adopted these rules and regulations early have more odor issues than those that it came back that it passed some years later. And the result is that there is technology out there to absorb a lot of that odor. And I want to make sure that in Rapid City we don't miss that we're also looking at ensuring that we minimize odor to the greatest degree possible.
I just want to make sure I'm getting this correct as well. When you're saying odor, you mean as in like you just smell it out the streets?
You know, when you're manufacturing or cultivating, especially when you're manufacturing, taking cannabis and putting it into an oil or some other form, that process itself can create odor. Typically, these are done within an enclosed building, which is what we picture here in Rapid City as well. So getting that right filtration so that that odor doesn't emanate out into the neighborhood, that it's captured in filtration and doesn't have a negative impact on the neighborhood. Looking at the detail, the devil's always in the detail, and that's what we're here to do, is try to look at all the details.
Anyone else have any questions?
So would the city, or would this come from the state, like the Department of Health, do anything for consumption or where it could be in a public space?
You know, we might look at whether or not, I think we could regulate public consumption similar to alcohol. And that is certainly something that we've been talking about. And I think a couple other communities in the state are considering that right now. So basically, you know, prohibit somebody from smoking marijuana in the park or on a street corner or whatever in public. And that's something, again, that's going to be a policy question that council's going to have to weigh and decide if that's something that they want to allow or not. But, you know, I would think I'd have to look at the definitions, but some of the current state public smoking laws probably are applicable marijuana, or would be similar situation. So there's already, I mean, South Dakota are already restricted from public smoking quite a bit. So.
Absolutely. And it sounded like when you were discussing the deadlines that the state has, the October 29th deadline, it sounds, I mean, I'm not assuming that Rapid City would immediately have everything ready to go for the week after regulations start. So, I mean, do you see a timeline for when licenses would be able to be accepted or approved after that?
Well, again, it's hard to say now, but I wouldn't expect a long delay, because if you think about the rulemaking process, at some point we'll have draft rules, and we could probably assume that the final version is going to be fairly similar to the draft rules. So I think if we're working parallel to the state process, once we can see some of what the draft rules are, then we can do a lot of our work. So I don't know that it would take a long delay between the implementation of the state rules and our adoption of our rules. In fact, we could probably might even be able to adopt rules prior to the state rules if we were pretty confident that they were going to pass in a certain form without a lot of worry about too many changes at final passage.
So just so that you folks are aware, this is twofold. One is putting the use into the zoning ordinance. Where is it allowed? Where is it conditional? Where is it just not allowed? And the second part is the licensing. How many licenses are going to be issued in the city versus the county, et cetera. So there's a lot of things to still work through. We do need to take our lead from the state on some of those aspects, but definitely a lot of thought going into all of this, and we just look forward to hearing some of the public comments that we know that we'll be receiving so that it's a good fit for the community.
During the planning commission, there was mention of a cap, and that, you know, the city can't cap a dispensary at 0, but you might be able to at 1. Would you be able to talk about that and the licensing issues just a little bit more?
Well, I think that's just the basic, that the attorney that joined us, the city attorney that joined us, is at a minimum we have to allow 1 dispensary, and I don't think certainly that's any of our intent to do. And that's a part of the discussions that we need to take to council and see, are we going to do this similar to do we do packaged liquor, where it's a percentage of the population, so that maybe there's a set number of licenses that we would issue, and what is that percentage, what is that number, and we need to be able to justify it.
I think it's really, that's a policy and a philosophical question. As Vicki alluded to, one of the reasons we would even talk about caps or think about them is when you look at liquor establishments, that's one of the restrictions on certain types of liquor establishments in the state. And the idea is that you don't want to be overwhelmed. I don't know, frankly, since we're just talking medical marijuana now, how much of an issue like a cap would be, but a cap is probably more of an issue when you talk about recreational marijuana. And, you know, then you have to start thinking about things like, well, how many of the medical are going to want to turn into recreational, or would people, start a recreational dispensary or a medical dispensary with the belief that whether the courts overturn the current decision on the recreational marijuana, or it comes back again in a year or two in another form. I think the assumption is here within the next few years, we can probably expect we'll see recreational marijuana. So how is that going to interact? You know, there's reasons you can argue for having a cap, and there's disadvantages to having a cap. I mean, to somebody who's a pure capitalist, they should probably say, well, rather than the city put an arbitrary cap on it, let the market decide how many dispensaries. But, you know, it takes a while for the market to work it out. So do you want to have potentially a dispensary on every corner where it's technically allowed? So, you know, those are, again, policy questions I think the council will need to decide, and we'll probably need to take public input on as far as a number and whether or not they want to impose a cap on the number of dispensaries and facilities like that.
I just want to make sure that I got this right. This ordinance is specifically addressing medical use, not recreational use.
Correct.
Are there any are you looking ahead into recreational use? Studying that or working on that in the case that things are overturned, or just to be prepared in a future, I guess, chance that it comes up again or is finally approved?
I think we're certainly taking into consideration and certainly recognize that even though it's not legal right now or going to be legal July 1st, that it could be in the near future. And we want to make sure that anything we do with medical is going to help us or give us a base that we like if we have to at some point transition to regulating recreational marijuana.
I think that's going to happen, where if the recreational does become legal, that a lot of these same uses, whether it's manufacturing, cultivating, or whether you're selling it as a dispensary, where once it was limited to medical, being sure that it's still appropriate if it's going to be recreational. So yes, and just the quick answer is absolutely, but for now we are certainly looking very closely for the use of medical cannabis, and taking into account that once approved, we have to ensure that if that use does get expanded to recreational, what's the impact to the neighborhood?
Since it's not expanded to recreational yet, will the city look into how they're going to monitor in the event that people are able to smoke in public spaces, how they're going to be able to monitor whether it's medical or someone's using it recreationally?
Well, as Joel alluded to earlier, currently in the state, smoking in public is not permitted, so we don't see that as potentially an issue. If someone is to consume the product in another form, I think it really goes to their behavior and whether or not they're able to handle that situation in a sober fashion. And the laws are there for them, whether it's legal or not today, that we can address that.
Well, and right now, consumption of marijuana as of July 1st, certain amounts of marijuana would become legal if you had a prescription. So really that's a law enforcement question and how law enforcement is going to handle it. If they, not only the police department or the sheriff's office, but also the state's attorney. So the state's attorney would make decisions on whether to prosecute those violations. So the city doesn't prosecute a possession or a consumption. If you were violating state law by consuming marijuana without a prescription, that would really be up to law enforcement and the state's attorney's office to decide whether or not that's going to be charged and prosecuted. And right now, I think a small amount of marijuana that they are not actively prosecuting is my understanding, but that would really be a question for Mark Vargo, the state's attorney.
Is there an idea or indication about specific qualifications that a dispensary may need to have since it is medicinal use? Or is that something that we're waiting on the state for?
That's a big part of the licensing, similar to when someone is running a brewery, there's background checks and such, and we don't double mandate that. We just ensure that they have that state license, and then we know that those things have been addressed. So we need to look at it, and if there's something that's not included that we feel needs to be included, we would add that then to our requirements.
And I think, again, yes, the assumption is the state is going to regulate or primarily adopt the rules related to what proof or what, as a dispensary, you need to do to ensure that you are providing to people who have a prescription and medical. I think that's primarily on the state. Really, for medical, what we primarily need to focus on is where in our community are these types of uses appropriate? What rules do we need to have to try to ensure that these businesses have a minimal impact on their neighboring property owners and things like that. Time, place, and manner restrictions on the use versus the technical rules for how the business is going to operate and what they're going to have to do to verify that they're actually providing to people and with medical need.
And is there anything else that either of you would like to add? Anything people need to know regarding this?
So this is a product that's being worked on as we speak. And for tomorrow, I believe what the attorney's office has brought forward allows us that additional time so that we can have some of these discussions with the public, with the council, finalize and bring forward those draft documents as the state in turn is working on their end of it and hopefully marrying everything together sometime around that end of October if everything falls into place. But we wanted you to come and visit with us today so that the community as a whole is aware that we have been putting a lot of energy into this, and we know it's something that there are those that are excited about coming into our city, and there are those that are apprehensive. And before we do anything, we certainly want that public input and our elected officials to participate to ensure that it's the voice of the community as a whole that gets adopted.
And first reading is, the working session's tomorrow. The first reading comes up to council Monday night, and then the second reading would be 2 weeks after on the 21st. And then there's also a quarterly retreat session scheduled for the council that's coming up a week from Friday.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.